the ambassador's registry listed 17 refusals. Archdiplomat Vasquethara reviewed each one in silence, her 4 primary eyes scanning the holographic ledger while her secondary pair watched the human seated across the chamber. He hadn't moved in 11 minutes, not fidgeted, not looked away, not performed any of the social discomfort gestures her species used to signal submission in uncomfortable silences. He simply sat there breathing. The ledger listed his name as Calder Marin. Former designation, Agricultural Liaison, Outer Rim Station 7. Current designation, humanity's sole diplomatic representative to the succession ceremony of Princess Valindra of the Sovereignty. The 17th refusal had come from the Vethkai, a civilization that could reshape planetary crusts. They had submitted their declination in 9 languages, each phrasing more elaborate than the last. Vasquethara set down the ledger. "You understand," she said carefully, "what this ceremony requires." Calder Marin looked up at her. He had what her translation matrix recognized as calm eyes, a phrase she had initially thought was metaphorical until she studied enough human physiognomy to realize they meant it literally. Something settled in the muscles around human eyes when they had made a decision they were not going to revisit. "I understand what you've told me it requires," he said. That was the first thing Vasquethara could not explain. She wrote it into her private report that evening, flagged it with a color she reserved for things that disturbed her sleep. He had not said, "I understand." He had said, "I understand what you've told me." She did not yet know what the difference meant. She would spend the next 43 days learning. The sovereignty was not an empire in any human sense of the word. It had no armies in the traditional arrangement, no single throne planet, no hereditary line of conquest. It was something older and stranger, a diplomatic construct so ancient that its founding had passed from history into mythology, held together not by force, but by a single, unbroken chain of succession ceremonies stretching back 4,000 years. The ceremony required one thing above all others. The princess, each generation, always called the princess regardless of biological designation, because the title was constitutional, not biological, had to accept a bonded companion from among the recognized species of the galactic sovereignty. Not a servant, not a political ally. A bonded companion, which carried obligations that 19 sovereignty treaties defined in excruciating detail, and which every species with any galactic standing understood to mean, in practical terms, a partner willing to stand beside her for whatever her reign required. 17 species had declined. 3 had not even responded. The Vethkai refusal had been the most diplomatic. The Shorvan had refused with a medical report, citing incompatibility studies their biologists had conducted, which Vasquethara found suspicious since the studies had been commissioned before the invitation was sent. The Pellucid Conclave had simply transmitted a single word in the common trade tongue, inadvisable. No one had said what everyone knew, that Princess Valindra's reign was expected to be the most dangerous in 4,000 years of sovereignty history, and that a bonded companion who stood beside her would, in all statistical likelihood, not survive it. Humanity's application had arrived 3 days after the Vethkai refusal. It had been written on actual paper. Vasquethara had held it for a long time before scanning it, as though she suspected the act of holding it might explain something. It did not. "Your species has been a sovereignty observer for less than 30 years, she told Calder Marin in their second meeting, in a chamber that was technically neutral ground but had been built to sovereignty proportions, which made every piece of human-scale furniture look vaguely apologetic. You have no precedent for this role, no cultural framework that maps onto the ceremony's obligations." "We have marriage," Calder said. "The bonded companion role is not marriage." "No," he agreed, "it's harder." She waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. She found this extraordinarily annoying, and wrote that down too. The three mysteries she could not resolve, and which she had begun organizing into a separate private file, she labeled asterisk human behavioral anomalies, Calder-Maran-specific asterisk, were these. First, why had humanity sent one person, not a delegation, not a committee, one agricultural liaison from a mid-tier outer rim station, traveling on a transport ship that had made 2 cargo stops en route? Second, what did he mean when he said, "I understand what you've told me"? There was information he believed he had that she had not provided. She was certain of this. She did not know how he had obtained it or what it was. Third, he had read the 17 refusals. She knew this because she had left them accessible, a standard diplomatic test, to observe what an applicant prioritized when given access to prior negotiations. Every species she had ever administered this test to had either ignored the refusals or studied the most recent one. Calder-Maran had read them in chronological order, taking notes, and when he finished, he had looked quietly satisfied in a way she could not categorize. He had read them like someone who had been expecting to find something specific and had finally found it. The preparation period before the sovereignty ceremony lasted 43 days. During this time, the candidate for bonded companion was permitted supervised access to the princess, a protocol that existed partly for cultural acclamation, and partly because the ceremony itself could not proceed unless both parties consented at its conclusion. 4,000 years of sovereignty history contained exactly one instance of a candidate declining at the final step. The civilization that candidate had represented had not recovered politically for 2 centuries. Voskethara escorted Calder-Maran to his first meeting with Princess Velindra of the Sovereignty on the 7th day of the preparation period. She had delayed it by 6 days. She told herself this was procedural. She was not entirely sure that was true. Princess Velindra received them in the Consideration Garden, which was a sovereignty tradition going back at least 2,000 years, and which functioned as an informal space specifically because its formality was absolute. Every element of the garden was a protocol, and knowing what the elements meant signaled cultural competency. It was a test disguised as a pleasantry. Voskethara watched Calder-Maran walk into the garden. He paused at the threshold. She saw his eyes move, not randomly but in a systematic sweep, left to right, near to far, and she realized he was reading the garden the way he had read the refusals, looking for something specific. Then he walked toward the wrong seat. Voskethara felt a cold bolt of alarm. The seating arrangement in the Consideration Garden was not labeled, but it was not arbitrary. The seat he was approaching was the princess's seat. He was walking toward the princess's seat. She opened her mouth to redirect him. He stopped 3 feet short of it and sat on the ground, cross-legged, on the actual ground of the Consideration Garden, which was not a seat at all, and which no candidate had ever selected because it was not a selection. It was the space between the choices. Princess Velindra, who had been watching from the pavilion with the preternatural stillness her position required in public, went very quiet in a different way. "He's sitting between the options," Voskethara said softly, to no one. "Yes," the princess said. Her voice was not what Voskethara had expected. She had heard Velindra speak at treaty functions, formal and measured. This was something else, something attentive. "Come." They approached him together. "That seat has a name," Princess Velindra said, looking down at where Calder-Maran sat on the garden stones. "I know," Calder said. "I looked it up. It's called the honest position." The princess was quiet for 3 seconds. No one has sat there in recorded history. "The refusals all had one thing in common," Calder said. "He didn't stand. He stayed on the ground, his voice easy, not performing humility, just settled. Every species that declined framed it in terms of incompatibility, biological, cultural, political. Every declination was a category error. They treated the ceremony like a contract negotiation. "And you do not." I treated it like what it actually is." He looked up at her. Someone in a very dangerous position asking if anyone in the galaxy is willing to stand next to them, not because it's advantageous, not because the ceremony requires it. He paused. Just because they asked. Vaskethara's translator reported the princess's physiological response as *elevated heart analog activity. It was the same reading her instruments gave for fear. She checked the instrument twice. It was not giving fear. The instrument, she realized, had never seen this specific physiological pattern before. It had defaulted to its nearest category. She wrote 3 new entries in the anomaly file that evening. By the 14th day, Calder Marin had been permitted 4 supervised meetings with the princess, and Vaskethara had begun to understand that she had made a serious error in her assessment of him. She had categorized him as *naive, an outer rim agricultural liaison with no political background, no diplomatic training in any framework she recognized, no apparent understanding of the complex architecture of sovereignty protocol. On the 14th day, she discovered he had spent the 6 days before his first meeting with the princess learning old sovereignty ceremonial language, not the trade tongue version, the actual ceremonial dialect, which had not been spoken conversationally in 800 years. He had learned enough to hold a basic exchange. He had not used it in any of their supervised meetings. He had not demonstrated it. He had not mentioned it. Why? She asked him directly, which violated 3 diplomatic protocols she had spent 40 years maintaining. He considered the question with what she had come to recognize as genuine consideration rather than performative deliberation. Because she might want to say something she doesn't have a trade tongue word for. Vaskethara stared at him. The princess is fluent in 47 languages. Right, he said, and in 43 days none of us will be talking about any of this. He said it simply, without drama, and that was what made it settle so strangely in her chest. Whatever she needs to say in those 43 days that she can't say in a language her advisors also speak, I wanted to be ready for that. He had not been preparing to impress the princess. He had been preparing to be useful to her in private. Vaskethara returned to her chambers and sat without moving for quite a long time. She then opened the anomaly file, reviewed the 17 refusals one more time, and understood, for the first time, what Calder Marin had found in them that had made him look quietly satisfied. Every species that declined had considered what the role required of them. Not one of them had considered what the role required for her. On the 19th day, something happened that was not in the preparation protocol. A sovereignty security report flagged unusual communication traffic originating from 3 separate galactic bodies, all of which had submitted formal refusals to the bonded companion candidacy. The traffic was encrypted in Vethkai commercial code, which sovereignty intelligence could not fully decrypt but could identify by structure. Vaskethara read the summary at 300 local station time. She sat with it for 4 hours before waking anyone. The traffic pattern suggested coordination, not between enemies of the sovereignty, between former candidates, between the species who had refused. They were communicating about Calder Marin. She did not know what they were saying. She did not know why 3 species who had declined an obligation were spending significant cryptographic resources discussing the individual who had accepted it. She did not know if it was threat assessment or political calculation or something she lacked a category for. What she knew was this: 17 species had looked at the succession ceremony and seen a political liability too dangerous to accept. And now 3 of them were watching a human agricultural liaison, as though he had done something they hadn't anticipated. She went to find Calder Marin. He was in the station library at 700 reading. He had a cup of something that steamed. She had learned this was called coffee, though she had never investigated what it was made from, and he was going through what appeared to be historical records. Sovereignty historical records, not recent ones. Old ones. What are you reading? She asked, because the protocols were already broken, and she had decided some time ago that honest questions were more efficient than diplomatic ones with this particular human. He turned the record so she could see it. It was the account of the one candidate in 4,000 years who had declined at the final step of the ceremony. I know about that, she said. The political consequences were catastrophic, he agreed. For the candidate's civilization, yes, I've read the aftermath. He set the record down. What I was reading was the candidate's own account, written privately, never submitted for official record. Your archive has a copy because Sovereignty Intelligence collected it as a political document. He paused. That's not what it is. What is it? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he said, someone who was genuinely terrified, who made the only decision they could make with what they knew, and who spent the rest of their life wondering if they'd understood the question wrong. Vasquez felt something she did not have a clean word for. You are going to the final step, she said. It was not a question. I told you I would. Why? She said it more sharply than she intended. You are from a species that has been a sovereignty observer for 30 years. Your civilization has no stake in this outcome that justifies the personal risk to you specifically. You are not a political figure. The refusals came from species who command resources your civilization cannot match. If they are concerned about your presence here, you have no protection I can meaningfully guarantee. She stopped. You are a single human from an outer rim agricultural station. Why are you still here? Calder Marin looked at her for a long moment. She asked, he said. 3 words, that was all he offered. Vasquez left without responding because she did not trust what would come out if she tried. The coordination traffic from the former candidates intensified on day 23. Sovereignty Intelligence had managed partial decryption by then. The content was not, as Vasquez had initially feared, a threat assessment targeting Calder Marin for removal. It was something that took her 3 full readings to process. They were analyzing him. Specifically, they were attempting to determine what advantage humanity was seeking through the bonded companion role. They had modeling groups running probability matrices on long-term resource access, sovereignty treaty implications, precedent-setting diplomatic leverage, and 11 other strategic frameworks. The Vethkai analysis was the most extensive. It ran to 47 pages. Its conclusion, she found this in the summary section, was marked with a notation that her translation matrix rendered as * result inconclusive due to irrational input variable. The irrational input variable was Calder Marin's motivation. They could not find one, not one that mapped onto any strategic calculus they recognized. They had eliminated every advantage a bonded companion role could theoretically provide to a civilization with humanity's current galactic standing, and the answer kept coming back to 0. One of the Shorvan analysts had appended a note that the translation matrix took a long time with, because the concept it expressed existed in Shorvan language but had no direct trade tongue equivalent. The closest rendering the matrix offered was, he may simply mean what he says. The note had been flagged by another analyst as an error. Vasquez set the report down. She called her senior intelligence officer into her office. Tell me, she said, if I am misreading this. Her intelligence officer, a pellucid whose designation was too long for human phonology but who went by the working title of Analyst 7, reviewed the report in the systematic overlapping sense way pellucid processed information. After 6 minutes of silence, she said, You are not misreading it. 3 of the most analytically sophisticated species in the sovereignty cannot determine why a human agricultural liaison accepted an obligation they refused. Correct. Because their models require a self-interested motivation. Correct. And they cannot find one. Correct. Vasquez turned to the window that overlooked the station's central atrium. Somewhere in this station, Calder Marin was studying 4,000-year-old ceremonial language for a woman he had met 11 days ago, because she might someday want to say something she didn't have a trade-tongue word for. Analyst 7, she said quietly. Yes. What does it mean when a species' behavior cannot be explained by self-interest? The pellucid was silent for a moment. Statistically, it means the model is wrong. And if the model is not wrong? Another pause, longer. Then the behavior is irrational, Analyst 7 said. And irrational behavior is, by definition, unpredictable. Yes, Vasquez said. She understood now why 3 civilizations that could reshape planetary crusts were spending encrypted communication bandwidth, trying to understand one human from an outer rim agricultural station. It wasn't because they thought he was dangerous. It was because they couldn't rule it out. On day 31, the first direct threat arrived. It was not delivered as a threat. It was delivered as a courtesy, a formal communication from the diplomatic collective, addressed to the Sovereignty's Preparation Committee, and copied to the Human Observer Delegation on the station, expressing asterisk concern regarding the appropriateness of non-integrated species participation in core sovereignty ceremonial functions. Vasquez read the subtext immediately. Step back or we create a problem. She also read the timing, 12 days before the ceremony, late enough that refusal would create instability, early enough that the threat could be framed as procedural concern rather than intimidation. She went to tell Calder Marin. She found him with the princess. This should not have been possible. Their supervised meeting was not scheduled for 2 more hours. She reviewed the access logs later and found that Princess Valindra had authorized an unscheduled meeting, which was within her authority, technically, but which had never been exercised in Vasquez 40 years as a preparation overseer. She stood at the entrance to the meeting room and could hear them through the open door before she decided whether to enter. The princess was speaking in Old Sovereignty ceremonial dialect. Calder Marin was responding in it. Not perfectly, she could hear the grammatical approximations, the places where his pronunciation was clearly constructed from written records rather than spoken tradition, but understandably, meaningfully. Doesn't have a common tongue equivalent, the princess was saying. Her voice in the old dialect was different from her formal register, more unguarded. The closest I can get is something like the weight of inherited obligation, but that's not quite right either. It's more specific. It's the weight of an obligation you chose, knowing you would come to regret the choosing and choosing anyway. A pause. We have a word for that, Calder said in the old dialect. Tell me. Duty, he said. Though in our oldest languages it's closer to debt of love. A thing you owe not because someone demands it, but because you recognize what it costs someone else if you don't pay it. The princess was quiet for a long time. The Shorvan biologist said you were physiologically incompatible, she said finally. With what specifically? They didn't specify. They said the studies were comprehensive. The Shorvan commissioned those studies before the invitation was sent, Calder said. The silence stretched. I know, the princess said. Vasquez stepped back from the door. She waited in the corridor for 7 minutes. When she entered the meeting room formally, through proper protocol, both of them were sitting in the positions the meeting record would show as the supervised configuration, and neither of them made any reference to what they had been discussing. She delivered the communication to Calder Marin. He read it again. What does this mean for the ceremony? He asked. They can create procedural challenges, delayed timelines, treaty reviews. In the worst case, they could frame human participation as a destabilizing precedent and build coalition support for blocking it. Could they stop it? Not definitively, but they could make it damaging enough to the sovereignty's stability that the princess might consider. "I'm asking about me specifically," he said. "Could they stop me?" Vaskethara studied him. "Physically, no. Procedurally, potentially." "Then we have 12 days. Calder, what does she need in the next 12 days? He asked. "Not ceremonially, not procedurally. What does she actually need?" Vaskethara opened her mouth, closed it. In 40 years of preparation oversight, no candidate had ever asked her that question. She sat down across from him without being invited, which violated two protocols she didn't care about at the moment. "She needs to believe this is real," Vaskethara said. It came out before she decided to say it. "Every candidate, every species that came before you approached this as a political calculation. She has lived her entire life being approached as a political calculation. The ceremony requires consent, but consent given in a world where every option is political is not." She stopped. "She has never been chosen. She has only ever been evaluated." Calder Marin said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know." "How?" "Because it was in the refusals," he said. "All 17 of them. The way they phrased the declinations. They were all declining an obligation. None of them were declining a person." He set the communication on the table. "She knows that. She has read every refusal the way I read them. That's why she still knows how to count to 17. Vaskethara looked at him. "You're going to let the Vethkai file whatever they file," she said slowly. "Yes." "And keep going." "Yes." "Why?" He met her eyes. His face had the calm she had catalogued on the first day, the settled look of someone who had already made a decision and was not going to revisit it. Because she asked. 3 words, the same 3 words. And this time, Vaskethara understood that they were not a simple answer. They were a complete philosophical framework she had spent 40 years in diplomacy never encountering, because it required a species willing to treat the asking itself as sufficient reason. She went back to her chambers. She opened a new file. She labeled it Human Behavioral Anomalies Species Level. She moved Calder Marin's individual file into it as the first entry. The Vethkai filed their procedural challenge on day 33. The Shorvan co-signed it within 6 hours. The challenge cited 17 specific treaty clauses and requested a full sovereignty review of candidacy eligibility for non-integrated observer species, which in procedural terms meant the ceremony would be suspended pending committee review, a process that took, at minimum, 4 months. The ceremony was in 9 days. Vaskethara presented this to Calder Marin at 600. She watched his face. He asked one question. Is the review committee selected by the sovereignty or by the filing parties? By the Sovereignty Procedural Council, she said. But the Vethkai have significant influence over council composition. What does the princess want to do? The princess's official position is that the ceremony proceeds as scheduled. She has transmitted that to the council. Vaskethara paused. The council has acknowledged receipt. They have not responded. Calder nodded slowly. What do the procedural rules say about a candidate who makes a public declaration before the review is complete? She stared at him. A declaration of intent, he said, specific, formal, public, in old sovereignty ceremonial dialect. He said the last part carefully, watching her face. Is there a treaty provision for that? She went still. There was. There was a provision in the oldest stratum of sovereignty treaty law, a provision so archaic it was rarely included in modern diplomatic briefings, because it had not been invoked in over 1,000 years. That allowed a candidate to bypass procedural challenges by making a public declaration of bond intent in the formal ceremonial language, which was treated by sovereignty law as a pre-ceremonial act with binding implications. It had been written into the treaty foundations, specifically to prevent political interference in the ceremony. It had never been invoked because no candidate in 1,000 years had been fluent enough in old sovereignty ceremonial dialect to do it. "You knew," she said. "I suspected," he said carefully, "when I found the old dialect provision in the treaty archive about 36 days ago. You have been studying old sovereignty ceremonial dialect for 36 days. 37, he said. I started the night I arrived. The night he arrived, before his first meeting with Voskethara, before his application had been formally accepted, before he had any official access to sovereignty treaty archives. He had started before any of those things. How did you know there might be a treaty provision requiring the old dialect? She asked, though part of her already understood. I didn't, he said. I learned it so she might have someone to talk to. Finding the provision was, he paused. Finding the provision was useful. Voskethara sat down. She thought about the Vethkai analysis. 47 pages, result inconclusive due to irrational input variable. She thought about the Shorvan who had appended the note. He may simply mean what he says. She thought about the analyst who had flagged it as an error. The error, she now understood, was not in the note. The error was in treating sincerity as an irrational input variable. If you make the declaration, she said, and the ceremony proceeds, you become legally and ceremonially bound to the princess's reign, the reign that 17 species refuse to share, the reign that sovereignty actuarial councils have projected as the most crisis-dense in 4,000 years. I know. You may not survive it. I know that too. Why? She stopped herself. She already knew the answer. She had known it since day one, since I understand what you've told me asterisk, since 17 refusals read in chronological order, since sitting on the ground of the consideration garden in the honest position. She had known it since a man who came to give someone to talk to had stumbled onto a loophole that might save everything, because he'd been paying attention to the right things for the right reasons. She did not ask asterisk why again. Instead, she said, the declaration must be made in public forum, the sovereignty public record. I can arrange the venue within 6 hours. Okay, he said. You understand that once this is made public, the Vethkai will know you found the provision. Yes, and that they will be furious. Probably, and that you don't care. He was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time in 33 days, he smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had decided to set it down in exactly the right place. I care, he said. I just don't think it changes anything. The declaration was made 6 hours and 14 minutes later, in the sovereignty's primary public forum, on record, in old sovereignty ceremonial dialect. Voskethara had arranged for a translation feed. She had not expected anyone to watch it in real time. Every sovereignty diplomatic station in the primary cluster was watching within 40 minutes. By the time Calder, Marin finished speaking, 11 minutes, in a language that had not been used for formal purposes in 800 years, with the grammar of a person who had learned it from written records and the cadence of someone who meant every word. The feed had been retransmitted to 43 secondary stations. He said in the old dialect what the translation matrix rendered as, I do not come because it is advantageous. I do not come because I have calculated the benefit. I come because someone in a difficult place asked if anyone in the galaxy would stand beside them, and I have found, in everything I have read about this moment, that she has never stopped asking, and the galaxy has never stopped counting its reasons to say no. I have no reasons to say no that I consider sufficient. I have one reason to say yes that I consider complete, she asked. The Procedural Council's review was suspended 18 hours later. The ceremony proceeded on schedule. There was a moment at the actual ceremony, which was private by tradition, witnessed only by Vaskethara as the preparation overseer and two sovereignty archivists, when Princess Velindra of the Sovereignty, standing in the ceremonial space that had hosted this moment 4,000 unbroken times, looked at Calder Marin and said, in the old dialect, quietly, "You know what comes next." "I know what you've told me," he said. She was quiet. Then, for the first time in Vaskethara's presence, for what the archivists would later record as the first time in a documented preparation period, the princess laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of her, real in a way that formal functions had not made room for. "Yes," she said, "I suppose you do." The ceremony was completed at 14:43 local station time on day 43. The transmitted a formal diplomatic protest within the hour. The Shorvan transmitted a secondary protest the following morning. The Pellucid Conclave, which had refused with a single word, transmitted something more interesting, a request for communication with the Human Observer Delegation, specifically requesting a meeting with Calder Marin at his earliest convenience. He was unavailable. He was in the first official consultation with the princess about the crises her reign was expected to face. The three separate destabilization pressures, the resource conflict in the outer systems, the treaty deterioration that had been building for 60 years, and that every political analyst in the sovereignty had been quietly certain would break within a generation. Vaskethara submitted her preparation report to the Sovereignty Archive 3 days after the ceremony. The report was 42 pages, which was 17 pages longer than any preparation report she had previously written. Most of the additional length was in a section she labeled asterisk observations requiring future framework asterisk, because she did not have existing categories for most of what she needed to say. She attempted in that section to explain what she had observed about Calder Marin. She attempted to locate his behavior within known diplomatic frameworks, psychological models, or strategic paradigms. She failed. What she wrote in the end was this: the candidate from the human species approached the bonded companion role without performing a cost-benefit analysis. He performed instead what I can only describe as a cost-of-absence analysis, an assessment not of what accepting the role would cost him, but of what refusing would cost someone else. This is not, as far as I can determine, an unusual behavior for this species. It appears to be a characteristic approach. They do not ask, "What do I gain?" They ask, "What does it cost someone else if I don't act?" These are not equivalent questions. The second question does not have a comfortable answer, which is perhaps why most species do not ask it. She submitted the report. Then she sat for a while and thought about the Shorvan analyst who had been told he made an error when he wrote. He may simply mean what he says. The analyst had not made an error. The analyst had found the correct answer. The error had been in the system that categorized sincerity as irrational. 6 months into Princess Velindra's reign, the first crisis arrived. It was worse than projected. The outer system resource conflict had a component that intelligence had missed, a third-party actor with interests in prolonging instability, a fact that sovereignty analysts only discovered when Calder Marin pointed out, in a policy meeting attended by 14 senior sovereignty officials, that 3 of the destabilization incidents had occurred at intervals too regular to be natural escalation. He had charted them on paper. Physical paper, with handwriting, the way humanity's application had arrived. The silence in that room lasted for approximately 8 seconds, which Vaskethara, who had been invited to the meeting as a courtesy, found to be one of the most information-dense 8 seconds she had experienced in her career. Because in those 8 seconds, 14 senior sovereignty officials realized simultaneously that they had not noticed the pattern, and that an agricultural liaison from an outer rim station had been in possession of this information long enough to have charted it by hand. "How long have you known?" the senior security advisor asked. "Since I read the incident reports," Calder said. "When did you read the incident reports?" 3 months ago. The security advisor's voice was very careful. Why didn't you bring this forward 3 months ago? Calder Marin looked at him. I did. I submitted a written analysis through the standard observer liaison channel. He paused. I think it was categorized as an agricultural logistics concern and routed to the Outer Rim Development Committee. Another silence. We have a filing error, the security advisor said, with the specific tonelessness of someone controlling a response that would otherwise be very loud. You have a categorization problem, Calder said, not unkindly. Someone looked at Outer Rim Station liaison and made an assumption about what the report would contain. He didn't say the same assumption everyone makes. He didn't have to. The third-party destabilization actor was identified within 60 days. The outer system crisis de-escalated within 4 months. The Pellucid Conclave's request for a meeting with Calder Marin was resubmitted. This time, he was available. Voskethara attended that meeting. The Pellucid Conclave's representative, a Pellucid senior diplomat whose working title was Analyst 2, suggesting she was very senior indeed, asked Calder Marin one question. When you applied, she said, did you know the role would require what it has required? Calder considered this with what Voskethara had long since stopped trying to categorize, and had started simply accepting as one of his primary characteristics, genuine consideration. I knew what the refusals suggested it would require, he said, and I knew what the candidate who declined at the final step seemed to have been afraid of, and I knew that 4,000 years of unbroken ceremony had been held together by someone being willing to say yes. He paused. I didn't know exactly what it would cost. I still don't. We're 6 months in. Are you afraid? Analyst 2 asked. A pause. Yes, he said. And you continue anyway. Yes. Analyst 2 was silent for a long time. Then she said, in a tone that Voskethara's translator registered as unsettled respect, our models have no category for this. I know, Calder said. It is deeply uncomfortable. I imagine so. You do not find it uncomfortable. I find the alternative more uncomfortable, he said, watching someone ask and finding I had a reason to answer and chose not to. That's the thing I don't have a category for. Analyst 2 left the meeting without her usual formal closing protocol. Voskethara noticed this. She suspected Analyst 2 was going to write a report of her own. She suspected it would also be longer than any previous report. The Vethkai withdrew their procedural protest 14 months into the reign. They did not explain why. Voskethara had a theory. The Outer System Crisis Resolution had required sovereignty cooperation from 11 different member species, and the coordination framework that had made it possible had been built largely on the credibility of the bonded companion relationship, which was to say, on the credibility of Calder Marin, who had by that point demonstrated that he was not a political calculation, which made him something extraordinarily useful in a system built on political calculations, a fixed point. Someone the system could not predict. Someone the system, therefore, could not manipulate. The Shorvan sent a delegation to the Sovereignty Station 18 months in. Officially, it was a cultural exchange. Voskethara's intelligence sources suggested it was, in practical terms, the Shorvan attempting to determine whether there were more humans like Calder Marin. She had asked him once, near the end of the first year. Are you unusual, she said, among your species? He thought about it. Some days I think everyone I grew up with would have done exactly what I did and wouldn't understand why it was notable. He paused. Other days I think I just happen to be the one standing in the right place. Which is it? Both, he said. I think it's both. I think humans aren't all like me, but I think most of us, when we're standing in front of someone who asks, he stopped. I think we have a hard time walking away from the asking, even when we should, even when the smart thing would be to calculate the cost and step back. He was quiet. We're not built well for stepping back when someone asks. Vasquithera thought about that for a very long time. She thought about 17 species with resources and power that exceeded humanity's by orders of magnitude, and the very specific calculus that had led all 17 of them to step back. She thought about the Vethkai 47-page analysis with its inconclusive result. She thought about the Shorvan biologists commissioning incompatibility studies before the invitation arrived. She thought about 4,000 years of ceremony and the one candidate who had declined at the final step and spent the rest of their life wondering if they had understood the question wrong. She thought about what it meant that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, more dangerous than superior technology, more dangerous than fleets that could reshape planetary crusts, more dangerous than centuries of political architecture, might be a species that heard someone ask and found it genuinely difficult to say no. Not because they were naive, not because they failed to calculate the cost, but because they had looked at the cost of the absence, the weight of walking away from someone who asked, and found it heavier than anything the role could require. The galaxy had spent 4,000 years waiting for the species willing to sit in the honest position, willing to learn a dead language on the off chance that someone might need to say something they didn't have a word for, willing to read 17 refusals not to understand the danger, but to understand what no one had yet offered. They had been waiting, Vasquithera understood, for a species that considered what it cost someone else to keep asking. They had been waiting, though none of them had known it, for a species that found that cost unbearable. And the galaxy had never looked more uncertain or more quietly changed than in the moment it realized that species had finally answered.